Now, ruling the Soviet system / Russian system isn't nearly as much of a challenge as you might think. Yes, you've got billions of restive minorities. Yes, your national security strategy rests upon basically enslaving them and turning them into cannon fodder, but you do so via a very simple method. You use an intelligence service that infiltrates everything within your country, and whenever there is a hint of dissent, you stamp it out lethally and quickly. And when you have a system like that, you basically base your government on information control. And as long as the security apparatus is functioning, you can then press gang the entire population to do whatever you want. It's not particularly efficient from an economic point of view, but Russia has existed for nearly 4 centuries in its current form, more or less, and it put into position a kind of strategic stability within the country that is fairly durable. Now, the Putin government is the successor of a coup that happened in the Soviet Union in 1982. At that point, in 1982, the KGB basically overthrew the other factions within the Soviet ruling coalition within the Communist Party. And so Andropov, Chernomyrdin, Gorbachev were all heirs to that legacy, and Putin is the inheritor of that legacy. Now, you combine that concentration of power with the collapse of the educational system in the Soviet system around 1986, with the country's demographic collapse, and it means that the total elite throughout the entire Russian system is only about 130 people, and Putin has had 23 years to basically purge it down to the people that he feels he can trust. So if Putin were to slip in the shower and fall into some duct tape and sit in a chair and throw himself into a pool, we probably wouldn't have any serious policy changes because everybody who's left is more or less on the same page. Okay, so with an elite that is that concentrated and that small, the capacity to manage the entire system is limited. Now, this isn't quite as bad as it is in China. I mean, China's a one-man show now, and even if Xi Jinping were the smartest person on the planet, he still wouldn't be able to micromanage everything in the system, and that's why we're seeing the policy ossification and cracks forming throughout the entire Chinese system. That's not that bad in Russia, but Putin has had to reach out to manage this system by allying with other factions. At one point, there was a bunch of technocrats like the former Finance Minister Kudrin, but more reliably, he's partnered with organized crime. This is one of the reasons why the Russians have proven to be so troubled in cyberspace until very recently. So you've got this concentration of power, which urges corruption, that is partnered with organized crime, which loves corruption. And as a result, the whole system is cracking apart. Putin himself, because of the concentration, has sharply limited who has access to him simply because there aren't a lot of people to choose from. So he has an inner circle of about 6 people, 3 of whom are absolutely incompetent, like the defense minister Shoigu, who's one of his old buddies back from East Berlin. In terms of the people that are competent, one of them is the chair of the FSB, whose name Patrushev, who is providing him with information on internal security, but is of less use on the battlefield. And his chief propagandist is one of the 6 people who's in the inner circle. So imagine if one of your 6 sources of information that you used to manage everything in your life was either Rachel Maddow or Tucker Carlson. He's just not getting information that's great, and it doesn't help that he kind of insists that everybody lie to him about everything. So we get this brittle system that's very top-heavy, but not top-competent. And in that sort of environment, in dynamic situations like, I don't know, a war, you are flirting with state collapse. On the security front, now the Russians launched their assault in Ukraine not because they were mad or because Putin has an ego or wants to rebuild an empire. No. The Russian demographic is in collapse. The Russian ethnicity is going to cease to exist this century. It's just a question of how long the state can hold on. Ukraine is on the way to 2 of the big invasion access points into the Russian space. And with a demographic that's in collapse, Putin rightly feels that unless they can control those gateways, the next time there's a major war, the Russian system will dissolve. Because there won't be anyone to defend it, so you have to concentrate forces in the access points to make a block. That's what this is all about. This is what it's always been about. That strategic desperation is why this war is happening. But the only thing that would be worse from the Russian point of view of not launching it and probably seeing the Russian system disintegrate between 2040 and 2070 would be to launch it and fail. because that would leave Russia completely open to all those invasion avenues. At the same time, it has paid all the costs for the war. At the same time, it is now under a degree of sanction from pretty much everyone as long as this government is in power. So we are looking, if the Russians lose this war, at a complete disintegration of the system on the time frame of like 10 years. Remember, with the recent mobilization, we're pulling about 500,000 Russian men in their 20s out and throwing them into the meat grinder. They might be able to make a difference. You throw 500,000 men at anything, it's going to make a difference. But it's going to come at the cost of the depletion of the last generation that the Russians have to even generate kids in the first place. There are less than 8 million Russian men in their 20s, and we're now looking at about 10% of them being involved directly in the war. This isn't going to be the last mobilization either, because the Russians don't have the tech. All they have are bodies. And in half of the wars that Russia has been in, where they've won on numbers. But this time around, those numbers are all they have, and when they're gone, they're depleted and they're never coming back. There is no next generation. So Putin, like Xi, is likely to preside over the end of his country. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about what's going on in Germany. I've had a lot of people write in with some less than kind things to say about the Germans because they're not providing what is perceived to be the appropriate level of weapon support to the Ukrainians. There's a strategic reason for that, but I wanted to talk about the economic sacrifice that the Germans are making right now. Now, unlike the United States, which is relatively agnostic about where we get our industrial inputs, the Germans have to have a plan because they don't have any of it local. So what they do is they cut deals with the Russians to bring natural gas in at large volumes and reasonable prices. That provides not just the basis for their entire electricity sector, but also their entire manufacturing sector, because that natural gas is processed into petrochemical goods, which are then the basis of manufacturing. So if something happens to the natural gas flows, the entire German manufacturing model fails. Now, back on September 1, the Russians cut off supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline and told the Germans publicly that until you cease participating in the NATO coalition supporting Ukraine, and until you lift all sanctions, we're not turning this back on. This was 40% of their supply. And that meant that the Germans had to replace that 40% with marginal suppliers, and so natural gas prices in Germany have gone through the roof to the point that it's no longer economically viable to generate electricity or the petrochemicals that undergird the entire economic model. The Russians basically told the Germans, you can be modern and industrialized and neutral, or you can choose to be Western and lose everything. And the Germans went with option B. And now that Nord Stream has been blown up, there's no going back, even if we had a government shift in Germany and Russia today. So we are looking at nothing less than the complete collapse of the German manufacturing model in just the next year or two. Could the Germans have done more with weapons? Maybe. But the sacrifice that they have chosen to make is higher than what anyone else who is supporting Ukraine has done. Now, with the bombings that we had a couple of days ago in Kiev, the German consulate got hit by one of those missiles. And the Germans sat up, noticed that real quick, and have already delivered air defense systems to the Ukrainians. So now that the damage is done economically and they know exactly what's in front of them and what's at stake, I think we're going to see a lot more of this moving forward. So Germany may very soon be not just the country that is sacrificing the most, but one of the countries that is also donating the most.